Hello everyone, my name is Vanessa Peña-Araya and I'm going to present our work with Anastasia Bezerianos and Emmanuel Pietriga called A Comparison of Geographical Propagation Visualizations. Propagation phenomena occur in many domains. For example, in epidemiology, we would like to see when a virus starts affecting people, how did it spread to different cities, for example, or countries, etc. Or sometimes when analyzing social networks, we would like to know how a fake news spread over a set of users, for example. Or sometimes we would like to see how a package was replicated in a network of computers. And in many cases, geography is key. So, for example, when analyzing the Ebola propagation in West Africa between 2013 and 2016, researchers found that although there were a lot of propagation between the affected countries, a lot of them were actually within each countries. And understanding this and understanding how measures impact the propagation of a virus can influence the decision for future epidemics, like the one we are facing now with the COVID-19, right? How the closing borders or quarantines impact on the spread of the virus. And we were wondering for this work, how can visualize geo-temporal propagation patterns for the analysis of this data, not only presentation. And we found little empirical data from the literature. So given that most of the visualization, the most commonly visualization for this case are animation and small multiples, a lot of work is dedicated to this. From those that are focused on spatial tags, we found one that is as abstract spatial tasks that focus on detecting a moving cluster, and another one that focus on extracting data from flow maps, and that is a qualitative study. And from this type of work and some others that focus on other domains like graphs, for example, one of the main conclusions that, of course, there are more, but one of the main conclusions is that animation is mainly better for detecting sudden changes between two time steps. And in particular for this study, the researchers found that small multiples is better to extract more information in longer period of times. There are other studies that focus in other visualizations, like the one you are seeing here. That is actually a work that we did in 2018. However, these works do not consider movement, for which these are not good for the kind of question that we're asking now. So we still have the question, like, how can we visualize geo-temporal propagation patterns? And we break this question in three sub-questions. The first one is how to characterize propagation patterns. What are the questions that researchers ask when trying to analyze this kind of data? The second is, from the broad spectrum of visualization, which are the most appropriate ones to represent this data? And third, how can we create realistic scenarios to actually evaluate and design a study to this kind of the selected visualizations? So I'm going to start with the first one. And to answer this question, we found two main sources of information. The first one is a very complete taxonomy of general movements patterns, and we complement this with research work in propagation from other domains, for example, epidemiology and social networks, these two mainly. And we found that, for example, in the past, several human diseases spread like a wave fashion, like between contiguous regions, like the animation you are seeing now. And this is the case of the Black Death in the 14th century, but also of for diseases among animals, right? However, humans, we are much more connected now, and we have means of fast travel, like, for example, trains and planes. And this means that, for example, we can see propagation like the pattern you are seeing now, with hops, with jumps. So here it starts in the bottom and then jumps to here and then jumps to other places in the north. And this kind of categorization, this kind of difference between pattern, like patterns without hops and with hops, we collect them all and ended up selecting 5 dimensions to characterize a propagation pattern. So the first dimension is a scope. Does a propagation spread into a complete, for example, country, or does it focus on a particular city? The second is direction. Does a virus spread, for example, only to the north or only to the west, or does it do it for multiple directions? The next one is arrival. How much time does it take for the virus to propagate to a particular region? The fourth is hops, is the example that I was showing you before. Does it happen between adjacent location, or does it have geographical jumps? And finally, peaks, when a propagation reaches its maximum value in a single region. And something important to mention is that the first 3, we extract them from this taxonomy of movements, of general movements, and we complementing this with these 2 last from work that focus especially in propagation. So once we had this, we needed to select the appropriate visualizations. And we ended up having selecting 3 representative visualizations. 2 of them, the first 2 is animation and small multiples, because they are the most commonly used. And we complemented with glyph over maps that is also used in other contexts. And in this case, it provide the kind of advantage of the first 2, right? Similar to small multiples, it gives an overview at once of the complete pattern, and also in terms of geography gives use the whole space to show the map. So just a small summary, in small multiples, what we did was to use color brightness to indicate the number of occurrences of each location, and 1 color place for each time step. So in this case, we see that we have time step 0 that have this pattern, time step 1, etc., etc. And in the beginning, there wasn't a lot of occurrences because there was mainly white. But in the last time step, one of the location has a lot of occurrences of this hypothetical virus because it have a very dark blue. Animation, on the other hand, use the complete space to depict the map. And again, we use color brightness to indicate the numbers of occurrences of each location. And participants were able to see the pattern by either clicking play to see it automatically, or to select a particular time step manually in the timeline. Finally, glyph over maps will look like this, in which each location have this grids that represent the temporal pattern, and the first cell will represent the first time step, the second, in this case it's 1, etc., etc. And the time step that has a darker border is the one that the participant selected in the timeline. Again, we use color brightness to indicate the numbers of occurrences. So in this case, for this location, for example, we see that the first cell, there was a lot of occurrences, but at the end of the pattern, there was a lot of occurrences because of this dark blue color. So something, a little detail to mention is that in order to make this visualization comparable, we try to make the interactions as equal as possible. And you can see more details about this in the paper. So, okay, yes, now we have the dimensions, what we would like to analyze, the visualization to represent the data. So with this, we can make hypotheses, yay. So we ended up having 5 hypotheses, 1 for each of these dimensions that became tasks. And we classified these hypotheses in 3 categories. The first one is tasks that require participants to make comparison between consecutive time steps. And this is the case of the task direction. You need to know what was before to see how a path moves, if it follows a direction or not. And this is the same for the task hops. Like, you need to know where the propagation was before to know if there was a jump or not. Like, even the work that we found in the literature, we expected that as animation is better for detecting sudden change, this will be the preferred, the most effective for this kind of tasks. The second category is those that require to make a search over a long period of time. This is the case of scope that requires authors to participants to know if the propagation is spread to a complete region or not, and arrival, when the variables arrive to a particular region. And given that glyph map gives this overview, we expected that this will be more effective for this kind of tasks. Finally, the third kind of task requires to do both processes. First, search on all the time interval, and then make local comparisons. So this is the kind of peaks you need to see when more or less is the peak, and then to finally select, you need to compare the consecutive time steps. And we expected that small multiples will be better for this kind of tasks. So once we wanted to evaluate, the first question that we asked ourselves was, how can we create realistic scenarios? And we had two options here. The first one was to consider real world data, for example, the Ebola data or other epidemic that was at that time available, or generate our own data sets. We ended up considering the second option because with real world data, the problem is one, it doesn't give us enough flexibility to create different patterns for each of the tasks. And second, it was hard to ensure that the difficulty between the tasks because of the data sets will be equal. So in the end, we generated simulation using a particular Python library and we created our own data sets. So in the end, we create data sets for each tasks and 6 variations to make repetitions among them for each of the tasks. And two important things to remark is that we use maps that participants were unlikely to know, and also that we use time intervals of 35 time steps. And this is important because it means that participants had to make analysis of long period of time, not just 2 or 3. The study itself was a within-subject study that lasted about an hour, and that included training and consent form and all the required stuff. And we recruited 18 participants. An example of the interface that we used, you can see here in the right part of the slide. Okay. So we have all the ingredients, right? Like what we would like to analyze, which visualization, and we conducted the study. Now we can analyze the results. So when we analyzed the effectiveness of the visualization of our overall all the tasks, we found that small multiples is actually faster than the other visualizations. However, we did not find any error difference in error rate. On the other hand, we found that participants felt much more confident using animation. And actually, when we asked them to rank them at the end of the study, animation was also the preferred visualization over all the others. And in this case, we found that the objective and subjective metrics were not aligned in our study. When we analyze more focus on the hypothesis and these 3 categories of hypotheses, we found that for the first type, in which we have this task that require comparison of consecutive time step, for the task direction, we found that yes, actually animation is better for this case. However, not for the task hope. So there is no evidence that for this task, animation is better for detecting sudden changes. For the second category, in which participants had to search in large time intervals, we found that for the task arrival, glyph map, the overview that glyph maps offer is actually supporting this task, but this only happened when there is one single region, which is the case of arrival. However, for the task scope, in which participants had to search in large interval for multiple regions, this advantage disappears. So we did not find evidence to support this hypothesis. Finally, for the third type of task, that participants had to make a global search followed by a local comparison, we found that in this case, yes, there is evidence that small multiples is better for this type of tasks. So in summary, we show you the process to get insights to reply in the question, which visualization is better for analyzing spatio-temporal propagation patterns. And our results indicate that the effectiveness indeed depends on the task, but overall, small multiples are faster and animation is preferred. If you would like to get the information of how we generate the dataset, some example of the visualization and the analysis of the results, you can go in the link in the bottom of the slide. So thank you very much for listening, and bye.